Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heidi from National Flood Services. My co-host today is Terry Calvin. A couple of things that really remain constant in the flood program. We can change technology, we update systems and programs, but I think one of the many constants in the flood program is really the confusion and the challenges that surrounds basements and elevated structures. So that's really going to be the focus for our presentation today. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Because of the number of people who registered and who are on the line this morning, I do have your phone lines muted. That does not mean that you cannot ask questions or give comments. You can do that by entering those on the chat line. Terry is monitoring the chat line. She's going to answer any questions that hopefully you have today. And so keep an eye on that chat line. There's going to be some resources that appear in there as well. Our presentation today is really going to be for educational purposes only. So Terry, as I talk about our objectives, let's go ahead and start our first poll, if you would.
Absolutely. Our first poll has to do with getting to know you, just what kind of experience level you have and what your position is so that we know who's online with us.
Excellent. So obviously our objectives today are to look at basements and elevated structures. So within those two big topics, we're going to talk about what really makes the difference between a basement and a subgrade crawl space and why that really matters. We're going to talk about elevated buildings and a couple of topics that really come up anytime you're working with that elevated building. So Terry, how's our poll going?
It's going pretty well. We've got 82% of the people in. I can go ahead and end that now. It's kind of slowed down, the responses have now. So I'm going to go ahead and end that, and we'll look at the results. You can see that the majority of our people are sort of an intermediate stage, although we do have some beginners and advanced people. And agents and office staff are sort of running neck and neck almost as far as the people we have, but we also have some salespeople and others on there too.
Excellent. Well, our look today is going to be more in the intermediate and advanced level. So if you are one of the beginners and if you have questions, I encourage you to go ahead and put those on the chat line. If I tend to lose you, go ahead and just let me know. But hopefully we're going to have something for everybody, some beginning things, some advanced things. So hopefully I'm going to be able to provide all of that information. But again, if you're a beginner and I'm going to lose you, just go ahead and put something in that chat line. So to start, let's look at the basement. The NFIP is very specific when it looks at the definition of a basement. A basement is a structure where all sides of that structure or that floor are below ground or below grade. It can have more than 4 walls. It doesn't have to be the entire footprint of the building, but as long as all sides are below ground, that is a basement. It can be below ground a little. It can be below ground a lot. Again, really the thing to focus on is that all sides are below ground level. So in our photos, I really have two different looks at the basement. The one on the right is really showing an entire floor. So a basement can be something very traditional as we look at a basement. I'm from the Midwest, and certainly basements where we all went to avoid the tornado, below ground on all sides. This could also apply to a single room. It could be like a sunken living room, Florida room, depending on what part of the country that you're in. But if all sides of that room, whether it be only a small portion of that room, are below ground, whether it's below ground by 8 feet, below ground by 12 inches, if it's below ground on all sides, that is a basement. And if you're looking at the lowest floor guide and kind of how that links itself to rating, you're going to be looking at a diagram 2A or a 2B from the agent's lowest floor guide. One thing that connects to a basement that is kind of challenging in the flood program is then what's the difference between your subgrade crawl space and a basement? A subgrade crawl space is still going to be below ground. The difference is really in the measurements. Your subgrade crawl space is going to be within 2 feet from the lowest adjacent grade, which is simply stating the lowest part that the ground is sitting against that foundation. And the distance between that crawl space floor and the next higher floor is within 5 feet. Typically, because it is not that tall, within 5 feet, your crawl spaces are not going to be living floors. They're not going to be usable floors. Crawl spaces can be completely below ground. As a basement is, it can be below ground on all sides. The difference is really in that measurement. So why does the NFIP really care about a basement versus a subgrade crawl space if both of those types are going to be below ground on all sides? The difference is going to be in the rating. Even though both foundation types are below ground on all sides, you're still going to use C2A as your rating floor. The difference is that your subgrade crawl space may not be as far below ground as your basement could be. Remember in the flood program that the more non-compliant you are with those flood regulations, the higher the premium is going to be. Compliance states that that lowest living floor should be above where the base flood elevation is. A basement is really simply a swimming pool that's waiting to be filled with water. So the more below ground you are, the deeper that pit is, then the higher your flood premiums are going to be. So if you look at it in the eyes of the National Flood Insurance Program, really the difference in your subgrade crawl space and your basement are going to be in the rating. How far below is that floor? Is that floor a complete floor that's a living floor, that's usable floor, or is it just that crawl space that's no more than 5 feet between the two floors, no more than 2 feet below ground? That's really the difference in why the NFIP takes those particular measurements. One very important thing, we talk about this a lot, and I hope it's one of those things that you leave this presentation with, and it's important especially for those of you who are agents on our line, is that if you have a structure that has a basement, in that basement area, there are going to be some coverage limitations. And as you can see from our slide, these coverage limitations apply to all structures in all zones. I'm going to throw out some terms for the newbies here. So it doesn't matter if it's pre-firm, if it's post-firm, it doesn't matter if it's in an A zone, a V zone, an X zone. If it has a basement, very limited coverage. There's a complete list of what's covered and what's not covered in your policy, and you can find that in the manual. I think later in our presentation, Terry is going to go ahead and put a link to the summary of coverage. That's always very helpful. But it basically boils down to the things that really service and make up that structure. NFIP does not cover pretty, but it will cover functional. So we're talking about central air conditioners, the foundation of that structure, hot water heaters. Those are covered in your building coverage. There are only 3 things in your contents coverage that are going to be covered in that basement. One is going to be air conditioning units, portable or window type. The NFIP will cover one air conditioning unit. It has to be set up and it has to be working. So if I just happen to store air conditioners that I'm going to fix in my basement, NFIP is not going to pay for all of those, have to be set up and working. If the laundry is in that basement, the NFIP will pay for clothes washers and dryers, Or if there's a food freezer, if it's as long as it's not your walk-in freezer and the food in that freezer, only 3 things covered in that basement. Again, for a complete list, Terry put our summary of coverage out there, both for your residences and your commercial structures out there. Take a look at that. If I had a bedroom, for example, in that basement, not going to be covered. If I had an office set up in there, not covered. Or if, let's say that I have a big screen TV. I've set up a man cave in that area. I can take that big screen TV, I can bring it up so that it's above ground, but as long as it is in that basement, not going to be covered in that particular area. So Terry, I know we have a question in there in our chat line. Let's talk about that question because that's an intuitive question.
Yes, it is. John asked about walkouts. And I get this a lot because walkouts are often called walkout basements. But where flood is concerned, we don't consider a walkout a basement because generally with walkouts, one side is at or above grade. And remember, basements, the definition is all sides have to be below grade. Now, there are some exceptions to that. I think you have a slide coming up, don't you, Heidi?
I do. Yes,
yeah.
I do.
We've got some pictures we'll show you. There are some exceptions where that one side that you call a walkout, you might have to walk up some steps to get to the land, and that's a different story. That could be a basement. But in general, walkout so-called basements are not considered basements by the NFIP.
Thank you. So our next category is, as Terry alluded to, that elevated building. The definition of an elevated building is a little bit wider and a little broader than what we talked about with our basement, in that your elevated structure does not have a basement. Its lowest floor is raised in some fashion, and it can be raised by foundation walls, shear walls. It can be raised by piers, posts, pilings, columns. It can be totally open underneath. It could be like your walkout. That's considered an elevated structure. It could be an area that's just enclosed. So there's a lot of different types of elevated structures, and we're going to talk about some of those different types. Also, you'll notice that there's a distinction in your regulations if you're looking at A zones compared to V zones, and we're going to talk about that in more depth as we go along. So a very common type of elevated structure, you certainly see it here in the eastern seaboard. I happen to live in Florida. We have a lot of these types of structures, especially along the coastal areas, and that is elevated with no enclosure. They're going to elevate that lowest living floor so that it's above where that flood risk is or that base flood elevation. They're going to elevate it using piers, posts, or piles. On our photo that we have on our screen, it happens to be pilings, and they leave the area below that living floor open. And that allows those flood waters to really either accumulate, if it's an A zone, or to pass through with velocity, if it's a V zone, with doing the least amount of damage. So that's elevated without our enclosure. So what they're doing is they're taking C2A and they're elevating it so that it's above that base flood elevation. There are instances where you have a structure that starts out its life as elevated without an enclosure, but then our policyholder says, wow, look at all that space. If I just enclose a portion of that, look at all the space that I'm gaining. If that does happen, and at a later point that enclosure is added below that lowest floor elevation, the elevation certificate on that structure needs to be updated to reflect that new information, because what's happening is now the policyholder has really changed possibly the floor that's going to be used for rating. And so that policy has to be looked at again to make sure that the premium in the rating is correct. That could bring us to our second bullet point here, which is that policy may have to be re-underwritten, because again, we're changing those details of the structure, which could change the floor for rating. Now, let's add another item in there, and let's say that there's a loss. So if that loss occurs, that policy has to be rewritten, adjusting it for the different foundation type, going ahead and adding in the information for the enclosure before that flood loss actually can be adjusted. So the policy has to be corrected if there's any additional premium that's going to be collected. Once that process is done, then that loss can go ahead and it can be adjusted. But let's say that that premium is never received. So I'm going to pick on John again. John enclosed, he had elevated, he enclosed that area. John did not submit any additional information. He didn't submit the elevation certificate. He certainly didn't submit any of the additional premium. What will happen if he has a loss is that policy, they're going to figure out what the premium should be. Then underwriting is going to reduce the coverage for however much premium that comes in the door if the claims department and underwriting does not receive the information. So it really does matter if a structure starts out its life being born elevated without an enclosure, but then we kind of give it a makeover and we add that enclosure. It matters. So the NFIP wants to know and update that information, which then brings us and kind of leads us into another type of structure, which is elevated with a partial enclosure. Here, we're going to ask, what is the flood zone, which is going to drive our compliance issues. I mentioned a couple slides ago the water accumulating. That's an A zone. A zones, that water doesn't beat against the foundation, it just kind of accumulates gradually. So in A zones, if you have a partial enclosure in that structure that's now elevated, in order to be compliant, that water has to be able to move, and that means venting information. If we looked at the same structure and it was in a V zone really has to look at the velocity of that water. How hard is that wave? How much energy is crashing against that foundation? Venting is not going to relieve that. So venting is not going to be talked about for these enclosures. Venting really only is dealing with your A zone. So when you're calculating what's going to be my premium, what's going to be the floor for rating, if there's an enclosure underneath that elevated structure, first you have to look at compliance. Once compliance is calculated, then you can calculate really what the premium is going to be and what those rates are going to be. So I did mention venting. Venting does count for those enclosures if you're in that A zone, because that hydrostatic pressure has to be relieved. And so there's a very specific formula that they have studied that really works in order to relieve that hydrostatic pressure. So there has to be at least 2 flood vents. Those 2 flood vents should be really on different sides of that structure so that your water can enter and then exit. Those flood vents can be no more than 1 foot off of the ground. If they're too far below, then that water can't enter and exit, or if they're too far above, especially, that water can't enter and exit in order to be compliant. Also needs to be 1 square inch of venting for every square foot of enclosure. So if my enclosure had 500 square feet, then I would need to have venting that equals or exceeds 500 square inches of venting. Those vents also have to be permanently open. There's a lot of different kinds of vents. I think sometime in the coming months we'll probably have some more information and maybe a webinar or two before the end of the year talking about venting. But venting, those vents have to be permanently open. Sometimes they automatically have louvers that open. Sometimes they open like you see the one that's all the way to the left, where it's just kind of a door that slides open. But the policyholder should not have to open a door, open a window in order for those vents to do their job. So that's really what you're looking at when you're looking at those compliance issues. I made the distinction of V-zones. V-zones are different because V-zones have that wave, and that wave has energy, which really creates a lot of damage. So instead of that water entering and exiting, that energy that the wave carries has to be dealt with. And so that enclosure has a totally different set of compliance issues. The use of that area is important. It can only be used for building access and storage. Those walls of that enclosure need to be constructed of breakaway walls. Breakaway walls are really kind of what the name implies, meaning that they're not load-bearing. They are going to break up. They're going to kind of release themselves from that structure, float away, and then those waves can then release that energy. The size of that enclosure in those V-zones also matters. So the enclosure can only be 299 square feet of size or less. Also, if there's any machinery and equipment, has to be elevated above the base flood elevation. And there cannot be any elevator that's below the base flood elevation. That's one of the relatively new ones as you're talking about V-zones. Couple of things in V-zones that commonly occur if you have that area that is enclosed. A lot of times your policyholder is going to store stuff there, store their lawnmower, store some equipment like a wheelbarrow, things like that. And it's just cosmetically, they don't want people to see those things, so they're going to cover those up using either lattice or slats. The lattice and slats have some regulations as well. It's typically, again, not load-bearing. It's just cosmetically covering up what they got going on underneath that particular area. If using lattice or slats, they can be no thicker than a ½ inch thick. The open ratio has to be at least 40%. And again, that machinery and equipment cannot be below that elevated floor. It's a missile that's going to do tons of damage, and it has to be above the base flood elevation. Slats, very similar. They can't be more than 1 inch thick. The opening ratio also has to be 40%, and the machinery and equipment is also the same. And it's really kind of cosmetically covering that particular area if you're working with that V-zone. So Terry, let's take just a little break. We have a poll question coming up, and let's see what we have going on in our chat line.
We have a question from Roy. He says, does this include service elevators that are not used for persons? Excuse me. I believe dumb waiters, that kind of thing, are okay if it's just like to pull the groceries up, as long as there's no enclosure. You have something to add to that, Heidi?
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at elevators, if it's an elevator that's carrying people up and down, what typically happens is they have to have a shaft for that elevator. And that shaft is going to be usually below ground in some manner. And so that's really kind of the problem or the challenge with elevators, that the NFIP wants to know some very specific information about that elevator as well. How far down is it in that elevator pit? How far down is that pit? Is it below ground? Do you have to rate for that? Because a lot of that equipment is stored in that particular area. So just because you have an elevator in a structure doesn't mean it's automatically going to be super high premium. It just means that there's just a little bit extra verification that the NFIP wants to know. And, you know, as Terry said, dumb waiters, things like that, smaller in size, typically you don't have all that equipment underneath in those particular areas. But the NFIP is going to want to look at that, and an underwriter can help with that particular process if you have something that difficult.
He also asked about, he said, was that meaning that the actual equipment of the elevator is above the BFE? And no, if that car descends below the BFE, then they get surcharged for that elevator pretty heavily.
Yep. So I believe, Terry, it is time for a poll question.
Okay.
This is kind of a trick question. Sorry, guys, when I went ahead and I did this. I did refer to the answer to this question, but it was quite early in our presentation. So okay, go ahead, Terry.
The question is, a walkout would be considered what foundation type? I expect everybody to get this one right.
I talked about it. It was quite early in the presentation.
Okay, we may have had some people that logged on a little late.
Kind of tricky. Don't worry if you don't get it right, because I just referred to it briefly. We're going to talk about it in a lot more detail in our next slide. So, Terry, let's go ahead and see the results. I see our numbers kind of fluctuating just a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to go, well, there's still a few people answering here, so I guess it's slowing down a little bit. Let's close it out. Okay, here's the results. And if you'll look in the chat, you'll see the answer to this. And the answer is that it's elevated. It's considered elevated with enclosure. So
but
Heidi has something coming up showing that.
Yes, we are pretty even on our split as far as that goes. Yes. You know, ever since I was born, we talk about you have a walkout basement. Well, in the flood program, it can't be a basement because remember I said the definition of a basement is it has to be below ground on all sides. Where your walkout, there's one side that's typically at ground level. So you can walk out right at ground level. So it can't be a basement. So therefore, it becomes elevated with an enclosure because you have a floor. Let me get my highlighter here. You have this floor that's now above ground, and they've elevated. But instead of elevating it on post-piled piers, they've elevated it on solid perimeter walls. And so that bottom area becomes an enclosure, which we talked about in just previously our compliance guidelines. So yes, if it's in an A zone, that bottom area should be properly vented. You will most likely, hopefully, not find this type of structure in a V zone. It's not compliant. It's going to be all kinds of pricey because there's no consideration for that velocity of water whatsoever. You're probably, hopefully, not going to see that very often. But you do have to look at compliance. And then if we're going to make this really complicated, and I'm sorry for you newbies, I'm going to get into a topic that is in that advanced level, you have to look at what's called positive or negative flow, meaning when I'm walking out on that walkout level, am I going up? Am I walking upstairs? If I would put a bucket of water at the top of that particular area, is that water going to run down into my walkout? That's negative flow. That means if I have to go up, it could be below ground on all sides, which makes it a basement. Or am I walking out right at ground level? Is it level? So if I have that bucket of water, it might go away from that walkout area. That is going to be our elevated with our enclosure. So why do we care about those two things? In a few slides, we're going to talk about, again, compliance issues. Yes, it all goes down to compliance. Is it compliant? There's coverage limitations, and I believe I still have that slide in here. However, we're going to look at the crawl space. A crawl space is just an area where the underfloor area has its interior that's no more than 5 feet below the top of the next higher floor. Again, instead of looking at a subgrade crawl space, which is below ground, your crawl space can be at ground level. It just can't be more than 5 feet. Typically, they're raising that lowest floor, and they're just putting in that small area in there. In A zones, you have to be properly vented. Our photo on our screen does show some venting in that area. And usually your crawl spaces are going to have your solid perimeter walls. They're not breakaway. Venting matters. If I'm in a V zone, not also hopefully going to see this type of structure either. It might not be as pricey as what your walkout would be, but it's not compliant, not supposed to build this type of structure in your V zones, simply because it is too close to what you're looking for in order for your flood risk. And I looked at our enclosure limitations, and I see a question in our chat line about the limitations in an enclosure. Yes. If you have an enclosure, this also does count for that walkout. There are coverage limitations. And someone's going to say, well, Heidi, you just copied the slide that we saw for basements. And yeah, I kind of did, because the limitations are just about identical from what's covered in a basement as what's covered in that enclosure. Again, if you have a walkout, that bottom area, that's what would be that enclosure area. That's just one example. Things that are functional, we're talking about foundations, air conditioners, hot water heaters, furnaces. Those are covered in that building. We have those 3 things in our contents coverage that's covered. Really, the only difference between our limitations in a basement compared to our limitations in an enclosure is that a basement, again, is that swimming pool that those limitations cover across the board. In that enclosure, they're going to cover your coverage limitations are going to be applied if it's a A or V flood zone that's post-firm construction inside of that enclosure. I look at it this way. If you have an elevated structure with an enclosure and it is post-firm, the policyholder should have known better, because they're now getting into some compliance issues, and so the NFIP is going to limit their exposure in that enclosure. Basements, they're just limiting their exposure just across the board. So enclosure only going to apply if it's a A or V post-firm. If I had a walkout in an X zone, my big screen TV is going to be covered. But if I'm in one of those higher risk flood zones, your coverage limitations are going to apply to that. So I know that we have some questions, and so I have purposely left a bit of time in order to answer some of those questions. So Terry, let's take us into some questions.
Always got to unmute. I start talking and nobody can hear me. Okay. We had a question about, would drywall be covered? The answer to that is drywall would be covered. Drywall and insulation are 2 of the items that are covered in a basement, but not in an enclosure. However, they cover the cost of the drywall, they cover the nails, and the cost to tack it up. They do not cover any tape, mud, float, finish, paint, any of that kind of stuff. It's just basically the drywall, okay? And the other question is about vents in non-special flood hazard areas. That would be your B, C, and X zones, the zones that do not require flood if there's a federally backed loan. And no, vents are not required in there. We don't need pictures, we don't need elevation certificates or anything in those zones.
Those are the best zones to write in because the policy is so easy to write and the pricing is so good.
That's right.
So
I
as
don't see any others.
I don't, maybe they are typing. So Terry, I'm going to have you launch our final survey and then I'll talk about some resources, and if we have any additional questions we can go ahead and answer those. Terry is going to launch really